Hello, everybody, and welcome to BCSDA Landscape. A warm welcome to our BCSDA members and also to invited guests who are not yet members. My name is Andrew Peterson, and I'm the CEO of the Business Council for Sustainable Development here in Australia. If you're interested in membership, please head to the membership page on our website. We're very pleased to speak with you afterwards, and you're able to make an inquiry, and we will be able to come back to you and chat with you as to the value of membership. In opening, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining you today. Those peoples are the peoples of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I particularly extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. For those of you who are not quite clear as to what Landscape is about, it is the BCSDA's monthly policy intelligence series for the benefit of our members, and by reason of our members, it is available for our guests to attend as well. Its purpose is to help business leaders interpret what's changing in policy, in regulation, and in standards, and what that actually means for strategy, for operations, disclosure, governance, and of course, risk. Our audience is deliberately cross-functional, whether that's sustainability, finance, legal, policy, external affairs, strategy, and of course, operations. Quick bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded, so please use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have, and we'll keep the session moving briskly so that we hopefully can leave enough time for moderated discussion. Also, a quick reminder that this is a non-commercial forum. Please avoid sharing competitively sensitive information such as pricing, costs, bids, customer-specific arrangements, or any future commercial strategy. We'd like to keep this discussion at the policy and the business implications level, not the detail of commercial impact. So, before we move into the main discussion, I wanted to briefly situate this session in the broader policy and advocacy work that we're doing at the moment at BCSD on behalf of and with our members. You're going to see in a minute the range of consultations and policy responses and processes that we are involved in at the moment. I'm not going to read through all of them line by line, but I do want to make the point that the volume, the pace, and the breadth of what's going on in the consultation space, both here in Australia and also overseas, is in itself important, because there's a lot of expectation that what's going on geopolitically is suppressing that particular consultation. Nothing could be further from the truth, can I tell you? It tells us that sustainability policy is actually no longer sitting in one neat portfolio, and you'll see that from the range of consultations that's underway on behalf of our members at the moment. It's actually cutting across reporting, trade, circularity, climate risk, hardly a surprise, productivity, industrial policy, nature, resilience, as well as government. So our role in this exercise is to help our members make sense of that activity, to identify the issues that matter most to business, and then engage in ways through the policy process as advocates for the agenda of sustainable development that are constructive, always evidence-based, and are member safe. Now, that means we are not asking members to align on commercial positions. We never do. And we're not dealing in competitive, sensitive information. We never have. We are focused on policy design, the implementation risks associated with that, the system-level barriers, and the practical conditions that help business invest, disclose, adapt, one hopes, and ultimately decarbonise with confidence. So let us proceed to that particular list. And to do that, I need to do this. And hopefully it all works. All right. So let me walk you through what's been going on. And it is quite substantial. And can we see that? I think we can. Okay, so for the purposes of understanding what the color graphics are, In our case, circularity is represented by purple. Deep blue is cities, innovation, industry, infrastructure and mobility. Yellow represents climate and energy. Grey, dark grey, represents corporate performance and accountability. Red is people, and green, hardly a surprise, is nature. So, doing a very quick overlay of what's going on. In the circularity space, a lot of conversation is going on at the moment about the recycling of materials, and the three policy touch points on this are quite instructive. The first is the work that's been going on by the Australian Council of Recyclers, as well as the Good Environmental Choice Australia. They are developing a new standard, that standard being the ARFS on Australian Recycling Facility Standards. This is going to be a really critical part of the EPR conversation going forward, because to baseline acceptable recycling facilities into the future in a EPR operation requires those standards to be adhered to across all facilities, primarily to drive a baseline so that we can compare apple with apples when it comes to recycling, but equally as important for business, so that the standard is applied to all companies in relation to their facilities, so that there is no one singular advantage necessarily, and that the cost of undertaking those standards are borne across the entire value stream. The second is the current state of the Australian tyre industry, and this has a very important connection with BCSD Australia, because our colleagues of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development actually run the International Tyre Project, which is a project of work that is funded and undertaken on behalf of the major tyre industry manufacturers in the world. And so we are at the moment underway with the review of the consultation submissions that have been made to that parliamentary inquiry, including the BCSDA submission. And if you are interested in this area and want to know more, please reach out to us and we can give you some intel as to what's going on, not just in relation to the inquiry, but more importantly, how that's going to feed up into the work of the World Business Council Tyre Project. The other is in the circularity space, probably come as no surprise to you, but the question of what to do with solar panels. And in this regard, the inquiry into solar panel reuse and recycling has just finished, closed its submissions deadline, and there are, I think, already 63 submissions that have been lodged on behalf of a number of constituencies, including the BCSDA. And again, we inside our organisation, on behalf of our membership, are looking at what those other submissions along with ours say, synthesise some of the key business intelligence and the solutions that are being proposed, and then come back to our members as to what they're going to be saying, with the expectation that there will be further inquiry by this committee, which has already started their face-to-face inquiry in the next few months. The others in relation to the blue area, being in this case industry, is very much focused on what's going on from a trade perspective. And the reason for this, and the reason why we are heavily involved in this in BCSD Australia, is that we have historically, ever since we started as an organisation almost 35 years ago, it's coming up very soon, have been involved in the conversation about the role of services, technologies and products in a green economy, whether that's in Australia or overseas. And so we play a very big role, probably outsized of our own organisation, as to the importance of trade and investment for creating new markets and new opportunities for those markets, for business in Australia rather, to operate in those markets. So, as you would come to understand, recently we've had the free trade agreement announced as between Australia and the European Union. That is something that we are tracking at the moment, and we are looking forward to further discussions with policymakers about the finalisation of the exact wording and the ratification and adoption of the free trade agreement as soon as humanly possible. The second and related to that is the possible association to Horizon Europe. For those of you who are not aware, Horizon Europe is actually the equivalent of, in one sense, the CSIRO, but it is an open platform in the European Union of some hundreds of billions of dollars for research and development on a variety of issues. And most recently, in the last 5 years, been heavily focused on decarbonisation. If a party to a free trade agreement enters into that free trade agreement with the European Union, then that party, the country, is able to actually access the R&D funding. And so we're looking forward to the opportunities that will be created for mutual advantage of innovation in decarbonisation and circularity and perhaps even nature-based solutions over the next few years. And so we've already made submissions to the government of Australia in relation to that, and we are now looking forward to what the possibilities of engagement with the European Union under Horizon Europe could actually avail. The other two aspects to that of general review are the general review of the Australian-Indonesian Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement and the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. These are they're not annual reviews, but they are frequent reviews of the particular success or otherwise of these particular equivalents of free trade agreements. And in each case, we have made submissions, which are now available on the DFAT website, along with other parties, to argue particularly around the effectiveness of the ongoing operation of these particular agreements. And in our case, we were talking about the standardisation of particular non-trade barriers, and the opportunity for interoperability around standard setting that is emerging right across the green economy landscape, so that if there's an ISO standard applicable in Australia through the manufacturing sector, then it would have replicability and operability in Indonesia and or China. So these are the kinds of conversations that we are having at the moment. In terms of climate and energy, lots happening in this space. Hopefully you're all aware that the Australian government, through the Clean Energy Regulator and the Department of Climate Change, are undertaking a new consultation around the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Scheme. And that's a draft process that we've got underway with our members at the moment. Most recently in March, actually it was in February rather, that the COP30 president, mindful that the COP presidency is still held by Brazil until it's handed over at COP31 in Turkey later on this year. And in that regard, the COP30 president, through the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Convention, actually asked for feedback from all actors, not just governments, not just countries, about two particular issues. The first one, roadmap on halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation, and also the possibility of a roadmap on the transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly and equitable future. And so those submissions by BCSD, with actually the involvement of our members to quite a considerable extent, which was much valued, have now been lodged with the UNFCCC, and we are now waiting for, and we've had confirmation that they've been received, we're waiting for what the next steps are going to be. That leads to a certain extent to COP31 and our engagement with the Australian government, with BCSD Turkey, and the WBCSD, as well as the Women Business Coalition, mean that there will be upcoming announcements about engagement, not so much formal submissions, but certainly engagement on what are the thematics and the negotiation opportunities that are coming forward for business over the next few months. So please stay tuned for that. We're just waiting for the final output of the climate risk assessment. There was information received I think at the end of calendar year 2025, and there's obviously been announcements by the federal government on the risk assessment framework, but I don't know if they've necessarily been finalised, so that'll be interesting to see. A piece of work that we, with the WBCSD and our network partners, are undertaking at the moment is I think it's the third year of the Business Breakthrough Barometer, which is a gauge, a sense check globally on what is going on in the efforts of big business in decarbonisation. And we've made our contribution to that. A number of our colleagues in the network have also been undertaking feedback in relation to the barometer, along with companies in each of the individual companies of the network as well. They will then, they, being WBCSD, will then issue a insight report at London Climate Week. So stay tuned. And if you're a if you're a BCSD member, you will receive advanced information about the results of that. I think it's coming through sometime in late May. So it'll be interesting to see, because there will then be policy discussion about what business is telling us about the barriers to effective decarbonisation that could then fold into negotiations at COP31. The other related point there is that of the greenhouse gas protocol. And a number of you may be aware that there is quite a lot of conversation at the moment about the effectiveness of the protocol and its future end state. Well, we are working with our colleagues at WBCSD and also at the World Resources Institute to bring a conversation to Australia in the next few months around what Australian business wants to see with the next iteration of the variety of elements of the protocol that are being discussed at the moment. I think there's one on scope 2, there's definitely one on scope 3, and there's also going to be one now on product. So please stay tuned for that. And if you are not a member, please come and have a conversation, because we'd love to have you in the tent to give back to the protocol team what are the barriers that Australian business are facing in relation to the adoption of the protocol as an effective tool for carbon accounting. We then move to corporate performance and reporting. I love that expression. It's just such a tongue twister. And in that regard, we've already kicked off a conversation with our colleagues at the ISSB, and we're now hoping to have one with the Australian Accounting Standards Board in relation to industry guidance deliberations on SASB, because you may have heard that there is a conversation about the role that SASB might play in interpretation of the requirements under ASRS S2 going forward, and that might also apply to S1. So if that to be the case, then Australia should be involved in the higher level conversation with the ISSB about how that's going to then filter back into and trickle down into other national jurisdictions that adopt not holus bolus, but certainly in large part the intent and framework of the ISSB standards. So again, if you're interested in that, please reach out to us and we will have a conversation with you. The next is I think the event that's happening is it next week or the week after in Melbourne with the Australian Accounting Standards Board, that's giving a whole day conversation to the progress and state of S2. And we're very excited by the prospect of that, because one of our members, the University of Queensland Business School, has been very heavily involved in getting a sense check of the application of the S2 for for companies, not just member companies, but companies right across Australia, and there's going to be some insights provided there. We on Monday gave an update to our members about the status of the Treasury Laws Amendment (Financial Reporting System Reform) in Bill 2026, or the bill that's going to aggregate all the standard setters in Australia. And with that, we're very eager and interested to see how that progresses in the next few months. And I think there's going to be, in fact, I think it's tomorrow, there's the likelihood of the bill, if not being passed, then it's certainly a further deliberation going forward that will come out sometime before. It's got to come out sometime before June, because June is the date upon which it's supposed to be effective from. There's also activity under the Sustainable Investment Product Labelling, which some of you may be intimately involved with. We, for our part, made a submission very early on in the budget submission cycle process to this year's budget, and we will be very interested to see. Ours was not about a request for any particular funding as such, but a request for a rethink about the intergenerational report and the budgetary process per se, because the factors being taken into account did not accurately indicate a budgetary process that was fit for future purpose. And so what needed to be done was not even a retweaking, but a whole rethinking of how the budgetary process needed to understand better how to incorporate decarbonisation, how nature positive needed to be put in there. And so we brought forward some ideas as to how that might work. As recent as 2 hours ago, the inquiry into small business insurance, so those who are in the SME space, of which we are also in, has notified us that they would like us to come and speak to the written submission that we've made on this particular issue. This is a particular issue for small business, particularly those in the sole and small business professional services sector, because of the cost of professional insurance in this country is just outweighed against the risk, to be perfectly blunt. And so we are going to be reaching out to those members who very, very kindly gave us some support in relation to that particular submission. This goes to the efficacy of the way in which insurance actually harms smaller business. And that to me is very much an S issue. It's about the social ability, the social license that this country has to allow small business to operate in the context of larger business. And so one of those precursors is that insurance for small business is very much outweighed in terms of the cost compared to large business. We're also seeing that the Select Committee on Productivity hopefully will make some sort of submission in the not too distant future, as with the Senate inquiry on greenwashing. One day they will make a report. Hope springs eternal, because it's been going on now for some considerable time. The new one is the draft pollution standards by the Global Reporting Initiative, and we are very lucky with our line of sight with Marianne Gruber from ZUID, who is a kind of focal point in Australia for the Global Reporting Initiative, and we're just finalising the draft submission on that to then circulate to both Marianne and to others to get some feedback. On the nature front, the call out here is threefold. The first is the state of nature metrics, which the Nature Positive Initiative called out by the end of March, I think it was, which is interesting given that the other call of state of nature measurement by the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, which came out, I think, last week or the week before, and is being requested, I think, by the end of May, beginning of June, speaks to the same point. And so we're very interested and eager to talk to our members and anyone else who would be interested in giving us some thoughts as to what the state of play in Australia looks like for the operation of those particular standards going forward could actually do to benefit the role of nature on the balance sheet. So this is the big question. The other is the newly announced National Water Reform. This is a regular review that's done by the Productivity Commission, and BCSD has for a number of years, certainly since I've been its CEO and even before that, been making submissions in relation to the role of the efficacy of the way in which water is accounted for in this country. And so it'll be interesting to see what that particular commission report, which I think is due out before the end of the calendar year, does in relation to the National Water Agreement. Finally, in relation to people, a number of you would already be familiar with the activity that's going on to strengthen the modern slavery legislation in this country, and I should be able to get back to it. There we go. And with that, we have also, for the first time, actually made a submission in relation to a taxation issue, and this is on the Select Committee on the Taxation of Gas Resources, which is kind of the number one committee inquiry going on this week in Canberra. Very much welcome those who are interested to go and see what we wrote. This was a very important deliberation that the members and the board of BCSD wanted to make in relation to the way in which consultation on major reform, particularly on taxation and fiscal reform, goes on in this country. So we weren't necessarily advocating one way or the other about the need for a gas tax, but how you go about making these really important fiscal reform determinations. And so we give some deliberation as to how that might be effective going forward for not just that particular reform, but for other reforms that will come down the line in the not too distant future. I think the only other one I wanted to highlight there was the inquiry into the operation and adequacy of the national employment standards. Again, the inquiry has reached out to us to ask us to make some oral submissions or verbal submissions on behalf of BCSD to bolster the written submission that has already been made. And if there are any members that are interested in talking to me about being involved in that, would very much welcome. And if you're interested in understanding this and any other submission that we make, particularly where it's Australian government and Parliament, you will find those consultations usually on our website, or you will find them in the parliamentary inquiry websites for these particular topics. All right, so that's a really, really quick roundup of what's going on in our world. And you can see that it is quite comprehensive. And when you look at the dates, particularly of those, you'll see that it said 2026. Those are the dates when those particular consultations opened. So that indicates to you how much is going on at a federal level or at a national level. There are also obviously state activities that are going on. We tend to focus more on the national, but we are involved in the net zero consultations that are going on in New South Wales. And we've also made submissions on the work from home policy framework that the Victorian government has proposed as well. So I think hopefully you can see that the consultation list that was on that screen is less of a list of separate submissions and more of a signal of the operating environment. Very much so the business is being asked to respond to overlapping changes in regulation, disclosure expectations, trade settings, investment rules, and even climate risk assumptions. So that's why Landscape exists, and we hope that you find it of value. But for the main event, let's now welcome and ask them to open their video so we can see them all. There's Nico, and hopefully there's Ben, and there's Joel. There they are. Excellent. Right. So this is the main event, people. Tonight's theme is very much around the question of recalibrating climate risk and fixing the faulty radar in economic climate models. I love that, you guys. I think that was a great title. So I just stole it. Now, the reason BCSD wanted to convene this particular conversation is really quite simple, that many businesses, particularly Australian businesses, are now relying on economic and risk frameworks. And we've already started to see some of that in the climate risk reports that they're producing under S2 of the ARS standard that came out earlier in the last few months, that they're producing these frameworks that may not adequately capture physical climate risk or compounding extremes or even tipping dynamics. So the question of whether boards or CFOs or the risk teams, the insurers, the disclosure teams, it's no longer for them an abstract problem. It really does go to directly the question of stress testing, insurance availability, capital planning, resilience investment, and the credibility of assumptions that are being used in reporting and strategy. So for tonight, the question is not whether climate risk matters. I think that's all accepted by the audience on this call today, but it really is whether the models and the assumptions that business are relying on are actually decision useful enough for the environment that we're now entering. So it brings us to tonight's speakers. And the consultation policy and policy landscape that I've just described a moment ago is actually full of a lot of different moving parts, which as a lawyer, I like to think I understand, but I don't. And so I was incredibly grateful for the work that came through. And so I really wanted to understand this basic premise of whether we're correctly reading risk right in the first place. If the underlying models understate physical climate damage, compounding shocks, or the tipping dynamics, then the decisions that are being made, particularly by business at this very moment, in the way they're then reporting to the market, actually is as robust as it could or should be. And so to help us unpack, we're going to be very pleased to welcome from a variety of different organisations under the umbrella of Carbon Tracker, We're welcoming Ben Dixon. We're welcoming, oh, I've got to see everybody. I can't see everybody. We're welcoming Ben Dixon. We're welcoming Nico Wunderling, and we're also welcoming Joel Benjamin. Now, Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, your climate carbon tracker, correct? Excellent. So, what I might do then is ask Joel to give a quick bit of context, and then I think we're going Nico, and then I think we're then going um, to Ben. Is that the way we agreed to do this? Please tell me I got that
So I think
right.
I'll sort of wrap up and talk about the policy implications.
All right.
Uh, Nico is going to start and give us a bit of a run through of the
Excellent.
tipping point science, and Ben will talk to the recalibrating report.
Very good. All right. So,
Yeah,
without further ado, Nico, over to your good self.
yeah, excellent. Thank you very much for having us. Um, Let me share my screen. I brought you a brief rundown on tipping point science and where we currently stand. Um, so can you see everything? Nice and
Yep.
good, good. So excellent. Very happy to get this started off. What I'd like to do with you in the next, just very briefly, 10 minutes is to talk about what is actually different if nonlinear components of the Earth system play a role on top of the climate change that we all know. So therefore, I'd like to elaborate on what tipping elements mean for the stability of our climate system. And let's start off with the climate change that we already know, and that is hitting us more and more over the last years and decades. First, here a fire in Australia back this year in 2026, the worst ones since 2020. But then also just only half a year ago, in a single country in Brazil. Here in the south of Brazil, in Rio Grande do Sul, massive flooding events, while at the same time, just half a year before, um, in the Amazon part, there has been one of the most severe droughts over the last 100 years. And what climate science tells us, as you're well aware of, is that all of these extreme events, be them droughts, be them heavy rainfall, be them extreme heat events, they are projected to increase in frequency as we warm up the world. So, for instance, a 10-year heat event under a 2-degree warmer world is 6 times more frequent. An extreme drought event is 2 to 3 times more frequent, and a heavy rainfall event is about 2 times more frequent. So our new climate world, if we hit 2 degrees, and we're shortly before 1.5 degrees, and will very likely go closer, and if we're not decarbonizing quickly, also possibly reach 2 degrees, then this is the extreme events that we will certainly observe. And this is, just to say, this is established science from the IPCC Climate Report 2021, from the sixth assessment report. But on top of that, on top of these extreme events, there are some components, some dynamics in the climate system that are essentially irreversible, and these are tipping points. And just from this article here in The Guardian, who also spoke about these extreme droughts in the Amazon basin, they also outlined that extreme weather events can put the largest carbon stores, as for instance in the rainforest, close to a tipping point. So what are tipping points? Tipping points are thresholds in the Earth climate system that are associated with central elements of our climate system, such as the Greenland ice sheet, 7 meter sea level rise if it were to melt, the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, drastic redistribution of heat all across Europe and North America, the Amazon rainforest, the most biodiverse area on our planet, or the low latitude coral reefs that might then be threatened by bleaching events. So to have an idea of what tipping elements are, we can essentially imagine that as this game of Jenga that some of you may know. So as global warming increases, we tend to destabilize the climate system and push out one of these brackets one after the other. until at some point we've warmed up so much that a certain tipping element, such as Greenland, Amazon rainforest, or coral reefs, would then be beyond their tipping point and fall over. And what is important, what is really different here, is that once we have crossed the tipping point, there's a self-reinforcing feedback that drives the system to a new state. So for instance, much of the rainfall in the Amazon rainforest is generated by the rainforest itself. Cut down parts of the rainforest, warm up the rainforest through global warming, less of this feedback, less rainfall for trees, possibly kick over a tipping point and lose major parts of the rainforest, and so for the other elements. And here is the newest update from the Global Tipping Point Report 2025 that has been led by the University of Exeter and the Potsdam Institute, where I'm currently sitting, with the newest updates on tipping point thresholds. So for instance, the coral reefs, their tipping point is likely somewhere between 1 and only 1.5 degrees. We're currently around 1.3 to 1.4 degrees of global warming, and will very likely even the upper bound of the tipping point of the coral reefs will transgress that extremely likely. And I'm going to go into detail in a second on that. Then we have, for instance, the Amazon rainforest that I've spoken about briefly. The tipping point of the Amazon rainforest is somewhere between 2 to 6 degrees of global warming, unless we also deforest. And that's what we currently do. Then it is set down to levels of 1.5 to around 2.5 degrees of global warming. So also relatively close to our current global warming levels. And what I'd like to do with you now is to go very briefly in two of these elements. And the first one is the Amazon rainforest, and the second one are the tropical and low latitude coral reefs. So here are the tipping point thresholds for the Amazon rainforest, somewhere between 1.5 degrees of global warming, where we will be in about 3 to 5 years, up to 6 degrees, with a central estimate of tipping of around 3.5 degrees, if we only look into climate change. And the other tipping element that I'd like to go through with you very briefly is the low latitude coral reefs, which is, as we had to admit in the last tipping points report, very likely the first tipping point that is already crossed. And our colleagues, Melanie McField, David Ogura, Paul Pierce Kelly, they came up with the conclusion that this is either already or in the next 3 to 5 years, the first tipping point that is likely crossed. And 1.5 degrees of global warming, up to their assessment, means that around 75% of the species in coral reefs are maladapted. At 2 degrees, it would be even 95 to 99% of the species that would then suffer from too frequent bleaching events as oceans over-acidify and global warming is too high. So very briefly on the Amazon rainforest, where also the last conference of parties has taken place in Belém, and that I was also visiting for a while. It is the most biodiverse area, and around 18%, 18 to 20%, dependent on how you count, have been deforested already. And what we looked into in the tipping point report and assembled the newest science on tipping risks in the Amazon rainforest is essentially the simultaneous threats from climate change, global warming on the Amazon rainforest, and deforestation. And what we found is that if we only have climate change, global warming, then around 3 degrees seems to still be acceptable for the stability of the Amazon rainforest. And only at 4 degrees of global warming, then we see large-scale regions that are at risk of transitioning from a rainforest type of state to something like a dry forest or even savanna type, a few trees type state. If we then also include current deforestation pathways, what can then happen, and that is what I think is really important here, is that these levels of 3 to 4 degrees of only climate change impacts on the rainforest can be brought down to around 1.5 to 2 degrees of global warming if deforestation is taken into account. While around 25% of deforestation across the rainforest, now at 18 to 20%, might be enough. So that essentially means that only climate change, 3 to 5 degrees tipping point, with deforestation, I'd rather say 25% of deforestation brings down the global warming threshold to 1 to 2 degrees of global warming. So these are values that we would be able to reach, unfortunately, by maybe a bit earlier, but around mid this century, if we don't stop deforestation. The second example that I'd like to very briefly dive into with you are the low latitude coral reefs that occur in more than 100 countries and are the marine biodiversity hotspots of our planet. And you in Australia are well more aware of that than I am here in Germany. But what our assessment with our coral reef experts has shown is that low latitude coral reefs contribute up to 10 trillion US dollars per year in goods and about 109 billion in GDP worldwide, based on the newest coral reef assessment report in the last year, and also of the Global Tipping Point report. So a really important system that is now under threat as the tipping point might be between 1 to 1.5 degrees. It is therefore the first tipping point that is likely crossed, and therefore massive bleaching events are already observed and are very likely to be observed in the near future. And stressors for the coral reefs are marine heat waves, the ocean acidification due to global warming, additional pollution, and diseases among the coral reefs, leading us to this assessment that coral reefs are likely beyond their tipping point as we speak. So just to close off, let's have two takeaway messages. One is that climate extremes and extreme events, they're getting worse due to climate change and due to global warming. But if we would be able to reduce a net zero or even achieve negative emissions, then the frequency of extreme events can be reduced accordingly. This is not the case for tipping points, because when we lose several species, for instance, in the coral reefs, in the Amazon rainforest, or ocean currents, then they are irreversible on human timescales, and new species, they take tens of thousands of years to re-establish. Therefore, tipping points will lead to very different climates and also climate extremes that are not reversible or very hard to reverse on human timescales. And we're here speaking of hundreds up to thousands of years, dependent on the respective tipping element. And therefore, it is very important to adhere to the precautionary principle and not transgress, or only very briefly transgress and then get back down below the tipping point of most of the climate tipping elements, as we're facing catastrophic risk when we lose the Amazon rainforest, when we lose the Atlantic Ocean circulation, or the large ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica. And with that, thank you, and very happy to hand over. Let me stop my share.
Thanks so much, Nico. And hello, everyone. And thanks, Andrew, for having us. Good afternoon, evening. It's a sunny morning in the UK, but it's lovely to join you. I'll just get my slides up as well. Can you all see those?
Yes.
Pleasure to join you. I'm Ben Dickinson-Bantam from the University of Exeter, one of the authors on the Recalibrating Climate Risk Report. And what I'd like to pick up from where Nico was saying there, and wonderfully outlining the climate risks that many of which we now see, but those kind of irreversible tipping risks which is really where the Recalibrating report comes in. And I will touch on this very briefly, but the main thing to stress here, kind of following on from what Nico's just shown, is that climate risks and increasing volatility that we're seeing in the climate system, and will do as kind of temperature thresholds breach, are very much economic, financial ones. Which brings us to the gap that Andrew mentioned. So traditionally, and something the Recalibrating report set out to address, is this historical gap between kind of mainstream economic models, which typically follow more kind of linear orthodox methodologies, and what we see in climate science, which is a much more kind of complex approach, mapping kind of non-linearities. And there's been this disciplinary divide for for quite some time, often in kind of influential kind of climate scenario analyses, and the frameworks, modeling tactics kind of used to assess climate damage. One of the reasons for that is there's influential kind of work by economists such as William Nordhaus, who, like I said, kind of typically see climate damage, so the impact, the loss of GDP that comes from as we go up the temperature bands, as a more linear process. Nordhaus is a famous assumption that he made as well, was this sort of idea that work happens indoors. So climate doesn't affect kind of 90% of the economy because we're all inside, and we now see kind of as the extreme weather events hit that's not the case. So the graph on the left shows that kind of recent estimates and improvements, and the sort of range of different sort of improved, enhanced kind of understandings of what economic climate risk, and just to compare them on at the bottom right, you can see the sort of Nordhaus assumption from his original kind of DICE methodologies, which put GDP a loss at kind of 3% for a 3-degree temperature increase, where recent estimates would say that that's at the highest end could be sort of 30%, or even more. So moving on to the report itself. So what we wanted to do is really kind of try to start closing that gap. So the report has interviewed and gathered kind of expertise from all sorts of climate scientists across the globe. Glad to have that representation from Australia there. And the focus of this was on what's known as integrated assessment models. So these kind of typical damage that typically use a damage function, which broadly maps kind of global mean temperature to a GDP loss that you'd see without, compared with this kind of theoretical baseline where there is no such thing as climate change. So I just want to go a couple of the headline findings. I mean, and I would say overall, something that came through time and again is that it's extremes, it's not averages that kind of define the future of climate impact. So to the right, you can see what's often quite rare in science, but a kind of emerging consensus around kind of inadequacies with kind of using sort of global averages like average temperature and GDP. And what some of these models miss, as I think Andrew mentioned, is some of these extreme events, particularly tipping points. So influential sort of models used by the likes of the Network for Greening the Financial System currently actually don't accommodate tipping points at all. And we often miss these kind of cascading effects that you'll see. So as these extreme, if there's an extreme event hits one area, the ripple effects across markets and insurance and etc. I just want to briefly kind of get into a couple of those findings and say why the issues and what came up through the research. As I kind of mentioned there, I think it's paying attention to the rarer but high impact events is what matters. So these can vary by region. They can also vary by sort of markets, and so sort of various. If you have a global average temperature, but different regions will experience higher fluctuations in kind of how climate affects them, and it's understanding, digging a little deeper to understand that, which is really crucial to understanding then the economic or operating risks that you might face in a particular sector. Something that came up, which was quite an interesting finding as well, which is the issues with GDP. Now, we're not necessarily going to get away from GDP as it's a helpful benchmark to an extent, but one thing that came through a lot is it can actually mask, in a lot of cases, these impacts that really translate to kind of underlying economic and broader social health as well. So perversely, for example, when a climate disaster strikes, if you have extreme massive devastation and flooding, GDP can actually spike. But as you'll see, this kind of reconstruction spending and an interesting example of this is kind of Bloomberg's Prepare and Repair Index, which is currently kind of outpacing the S&P, which kind of evidences that while physical capital might be sort of destroyed, ecosystems damaged, and human mortality affected. On a graph, if you're just looking at GDP, it will sort of point upward. A couple of takeaways are outlined, which we won't go into much detail on, but it's just to reiterate, kind of looking at alternative kind of broader metrics, thinking kind of twice about what, which I think is probably maybe evident after this talk, but thinking twice about modelling results that might show fairly optimistic or benign kind of damages. And just go into a little detail on a couple of other points that came out, which one of these is that, and these I think are important kind of for a longer term horizon as well as the short term, but ultimately what scientists see is that physical climate damages from physical risk are structural and cascading, so they knock across supply chains, and as we reach tipping points, high levels of warming, these impacts are more likely to cascade more frequently, and as that happens again and again, you've got supply chain shocks, geopolitical conflict, in unstable resources that effectively just undermine the conditions for stable growth. So that's one of the reasons why these kind of linear models that just assume that climate will indefinitely sort of just chip away at GDP and are flawed. So I think a takeaway message on that is to kind of look where possible kind of beyond short-term cycles. So preparing for kind of and looking ahead to kind of shock resilience, even if models and kind of short-term pressures, which I do appreciate, but looking ahead to kind of what might those shocks be and how could you prepare for them. Engaging with kind of investors and policymakers on adaptation, I think is increasingly critical, and kind of seeking transparency around how models that are assessing climate risks. To move across to the right, I think a critical one, which links back to what Nico was saying, is that uncertainty, the closer we get to 2 degrees and beyond, although hopefully that's not the case, uncertainty and the risk of kind of tipping points and broader, almost high impact consequences that are actually quite difficult to predict, but nonetheless ultimately really severe, are more likely. So that could, these threats may then become kind of portfolio wide, and you also see ripple effects through kind of insurance, real estate, banking, sovereign debt. So something on that, which I think Nico's mentioned, but is adopting this kind of precautionary principle and really kind of paying attention, not just to kind of averages, but trying to get a picture of the upper end of those ranges, because actually it's what's known as the tail risks, as you see on the Scorpion there, but they could be what really matters. And I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I'll try and wrap up briefly.
Got a minute?
Okay. Just a couple of, so there's much more in the report, but a couple of recommendations, kind of next steps, and these could be kind of practices for assessing models and the climate damages, as I've mentioned, kind of more unlikely to grow slowly with temperature, but actually kind of follow more kind of exponential logistic paths. So kind of next phase of work is really kind of trying to adapt models and get some expert consensus on kind of what how at the higher sort of policy level we take those forward. A kind of a shorter term thing, which is quite important, is just sort of scrutinizing the current models, I guess, for their robustness and transparency. So trying to look at kind of what damage functions are being used and what kind of means. I've mentioned tails already, and both integrating kind of tipping risks, extreme events, and the way these cascade. So kind of where models aren't updated, looking at kind of alternative sources, paying attention to the ranges where you can find them, and really just proactively start managing, trying to, where possible, sort of outside of the models that you've got, like understanding and managing risk exposure. I'm going to pass over to Joel because I appreciate we're rattling through, but any questions after this, please do feel free to get in touch, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
Thanks, Ben. Joel, bring it home.
Okay. In a moment. Sorry.
I don't know what
Look,
the
apologies,
greatest
folks.
yeah,
My slide deck's not coming up in my share options. I'm just going to very conscious of the time. I've only got sort of 5 minutes, so
okay.
I'm just going to kind of briefly kind of talk through the implications of some of what we've heard from particularly from kind of Nico and Ben on the kind of climate science for the policy sphere. So one of the key issues here is that this idea of the kind of faulty radar we're seeing of climate risk assessment actually is not just an issue which affects financial markets. There are also kind of clear implications here for government policy. So, for example, if we think about kind of how this information is used in the UK context, the same assessments from economists of climate damage are essentially synthesized by the likes of the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, the OBR, in the UK. That information is shared with central government. So those reports go into the Bank of England and into the Treasury. That information then impacts on what governments are likely to spend on now versus what they're going to defer into the future. So the cost of doing nothing versus the cost of doing something. And what we've found when we look at the climate scenario analysis done by financial institutions, so we looked at, for example, in Australia, disclosures from the Uni Super Fund in 2023.
Hmm.
They said that they applied a plausible worst case scenario of 4.3 degrees warming. That would they acknowledge result in catastrophic impact to the economy, or sorry, to society, to the environment, but the rest of the portfolio would somehow be acceptable. Now, in 2023, Carbon Tracker published this report, Loading the Dice, with Professor Steve Keen, prominent Australian economist. He was one of the 8 economists to correctly predict the 2008 financial crisis. What Professor Keen observed in his research is that all through this kind of process of translating scientific research from people like William Nordhaus, who received a Nobel Prize for his work, into economic risk assessments used by investment consultants, actuaries, and ultimately by pension funds, banks, and regulators, is that at each step in the process, essentially, people relied on the reputation of the layer that preceded them rather than scrutiny of the work undertaken.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, kind of blind trust in the economic research, which is the base layer of this assessment. So, when you do that, we end up in a situation where, Chris Wright, the US Energy Secretary, can stand up in Paris at the IEA and say, well, look, climate change is real. But if you listen to climate economists, we might only see 2, 3, 4% GDP damage by the end of the century. Now, no climate scientist thinks that. So we really need to talk about kind of how we close this gap between climate science expectations and economic expectations. The core of that lies in the failure of the peer review process and the fact that economists have not substantively consulted climate scientists through their work. Unfortunately, no one has a real interest in kind of solving that problem. So governments don't see it as their problem to fix. Financial markets are such that they will correct and step in, as we saw with the COTS paper, papers which seek to increase damages and therefore have implications for capital reserve ratios for regulation. But when economists produce reports that result in low damage estimates, there's no equivalent kind of mechanism to correct that erroneous research. So until we kind of, I guess, address some of these underlying kind of market structures, we're going to continue to underprice climate risk. Government investment is going to continue to lag the kind of targets set out in Paris. And we're going to be in the situation where we're having to fund both increasingly kind of rapid adaptation efforts
Mm.
and somehow try and continue to
Decouple.
maintain
Yeah,
funding for mitigation, which gets harder and harder. So
exactly.
I think, yeah, that's a whistle stop assessment in terms of where we are. I think to point you to a couple of resources for financial markets, and I'm going to share this in slides after the talk. Interestingly, JP Morgan just published a report last week on tipping points, one of the first major global banks to do so. Interesting, particularly given they're the biggest global bank funder of fossil fuels. So take of that what you will. And I'd also kind of point particularly financial sector users to Trex analysis. Now they're a relatively kind of startup investment consultant, information provider based in the UK. They have set up a tipping point scenarios user group, which companies can kind of join to share information on how to kind of better price these nonlinear risks, which kind of Ben and Nico have been talking about. They have kind of monthly meetings, and anyone is kind of welcome to join. So I would encourage you to kind of get in touch with Trex and I guess share the lessons from others that have gone on this journey of trying to move from linear kind of damage models, which ignore most of the nasty stuff, to try and realistically price where we're currently heading. So I'll leave it there.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Joel. And to all three of you, if you've got the chance to send me your presentations, I will put them into Monday's newsletter out to about 470 subscribers in Australia. So that's really quite powerful. And I really do thank you so much for joining us today. I'm conscious that for one of you it was at 8 o'clock in the morning, but we have to do that too. And for the others, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And in particular to our presenters for helping us to translate what I found to be a really, really helpful window into what's still missing in this conversation. And it's the architecture of the way in which we frame this risk rather than talking about just it's a climate change issue that is of worry. It's worrying that we're not changing the system faster. With that, thank you so much for joining us, the three of you, Ben, Joel, and Nico. And thank you to all of us, to those who have joined us today, both the members and invited guests. Quick reminder that our next landscape will be held on Monday, the 26th of May at 5 p.m. And on that one, we'll be looking forward to welcoming Frank Giozzo from the Australian National University for a discussion on carbon leakage border carbon adjustments and what the climate/carbon tariff style measures that could be proposed might mean for Australian business and the industrial climate policy. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. If you're a member and you'd like to engage further on any of the policy or advocacy issues you've heard today, please contact me. If you're joining us as a guest and you'd like to know more about membership, please head out to the membership page. And for those who are our guest speakers today, thank you so much. And make sure you send that rich content to me so that I can share with a very interested Australian business audience. But for now, thank you so much for joining us. And as I always say when I sign off, look forward to seeing all of you somewhere in the future. Bye for now.
Thank you very much for the invitation. All the best to you.
Thanks, Andrew.
Very much, Andrew.